Okay, welcome back to the series I've decided to call Respect Your Elders, where we talk about the history of fandom and fanfic. If you missed my earlier videos, basically all you need to know is that all of modern fandom can trace its roots back to Star Trek. And with that, I want to talk about the history of slash. Not slash the concept, but slash the term itself. So if you don't know what slash or slash fics are, it's a term that describes any usually non-canon same-sex pairing. It can be used for men and women, but it's usually used specifically for men, with the term fem slash pertaining specifically to WLW relationships. Now, how did this term arise? Well, it's pretty simple. Back in the day before ship names, the denotation character A / character B was used to describe when a certain pairing was going to show up in a story. And if you go on AO3 today, you'll notice that this is still the denotation that's used. Now for the Star Trek specific parts. Now, this terminology did arise during the Star Trek fandom, of course, specifically with Kirk / Spock. And it became so prevalent that the abbreviation K/S started being used to describe gay relationships in other fandoms, which I just think is so cool. And thus the slash symbol became immortalized as its own genre. And that is why we don't call it Spurk.
Fanfiction has long been the realm of women. Starting from Star Trek, wherein housewives not only got the show renewed, but created a whole subculture of fanzines and male-less fanfic sharing, fandom culture has spawned a myriad of websites, communities, and cultures.
Before the internet, fanfiction was disseminated in zines like these. You would send in your $10, $15 to a fan whose address you would find in the back of a book like this, and they would send you the next one. They were also shared at cons and within specific communities. They were all shared through a network of fans who were doing all their own editing, writing, and publishing. If anyone wants to talk more about pre-internet fandom, please, it's my favorite topic.
Over the years, the landscape of fan fiction, just like many French cultures, has become more mainstream and accessible. The internet has played a large role in doing so, as the proliferation of fansites, from LiveJournal to fanfiction.net to AO3, has made it easier than ever to find stories regarding one's favorite characters. However, the culture of fanfiction itself has changed as well, and now looks very different than it did back in the 60s. Older fanfiction served several purposes: to create new situations for beloved characters, to allow for a continuation or deeper exploration of canon events, or just to illustrate a love of a franchise or idea. Often, fanfiction writers and readers seek gay pairings, known as slash, to address the gap between the lack of female character development or chemistry on screen with the romance between male characters, who are often more developed, multifaceted, and interesting.
There are a lot of comments like this, and I'm not targeting you specifically, you're just the most recent one to comment something like this. There is a lot of misogyny that goes into this, both external and internal. I'll use Stephen Moffat as an example. We like to say that Stephen Moffat writes really good female characters. The truth is he doesn't. He fetishizes his female characters. He writes a very specific type of female character that he really likes. And while they may feel more multi-dimensional, at the end of the day, they're still problematic, because his misogyny colors the way that he writes women. And that's something that people who were socialized female growing up pick up on. And that's a reason that a lot of people who identify as women don't tend to write fan fiction for female characters in media, because we can feel the misogyny of how they were written by men. And when they are written well, we're so caught up in protecting ourselves that we just tend to ignore female characters to begin with, because we've been burned so hard in the past.
Other times, fanfiction offers a way to further explore and critique a franchise. One such example can be seen in Kista, a fan novel written by Jane Land and originally published as a 267-page zine in 1986. The summary reads, Spock and Christine are stranded on a planet with a Paleolithic technology level. They have to adapt to the local culture, and a relationship develops between them. Kista is an attempt to rescue one of Star Trek's female characters from an artificially imposed case of foolishness. Try to think objectively for a minute about what we know of Christine Chapel's background, education, accomplishments, and you will come up with a far more interesting character than she was ever allowed to be. I like her. I hope you do too. The novel follows Spock and Christine after they are kidnapped while on shore leave by slave traders, and then abandoned on an underdeveloped planet whose people have yet to reach an agricultural revolution. Not only is this an enjoyable exploration of how two modern-day people will be able to survive in such circumstances, but it also takes place in and critiques a patriarchal culture, as the tribe they end up joining heavily oppresses women. This was actually my first introduction to the concept of female genital mutilation, as Christine opposes the tradition and influences the group to abandon it. The sequel novel, Demeter, has a description which reads, A threatened all-female colony will only accept help from women. Ahura and Christine lead an Enterprise team to battle the prejudices of the colonists and the Federation, as well as more sinister forces that imperil them both. set 7 years after Kista, but stands on its own. When I finished Kista, I simply could not concentrate on the immediate sequel. When I tried, I came up blank, so I jumped ahead in time and tackled a question that had been bothering me. Just how sexist is the Federation? Granted that Star Trek was unusually enlightened for the 1960s, there are elements of it which seem offensive in the 80s. And if we accept it as a depiction of the 23rd century, where does that leave us? This novel is even more explicitly feminist than the original, as it explores separatism and critiques it, notes the way that Christine's role as a mother led to being treated differently within her career, as well as how aging caused her peers to view her differently. It is hard to condense just how impactful and well-written these novels are into a short review, but the quality of them is evident to anyone who takes the chance to read them. This is not to say that only good fanfiction existed during this period. After all, the term Mary Sue originated from the name of a character in A Trekkie's Tale, published in 1973.
Whenever we bring up Mary Sue as a very misogynistic and sexist term now, someone will always point out, it was actually coined by a woman. Yes, a woman in the fanfiction community. Fanfiction, the niche subgenre of fandom, the one that actually most people in fandom don't read. Fanfiction, which is also used as an insult whenever something is not written well, they'll say like, oh, it's just fanfiction. And I bring it up because the original Mary Sue is a character that exists in a canon story to which all the characters and the story is warped around them. That everyone is out of character, that the plot no longer makes sense in order to cater to this inserted character. In fanfiction. Now the term has been hijacked simply to mean female character exists in what is usually a male-dominated media. And in all honesty, the woman who coined the term Mary Sue, she had some internalized misogyny going on. Mary Sue was coined pre-AO3 era, obviously, but as a fanfic reader myself, I want to ask, why did you keep reading those stories with female OCs in it then? Why didn't you just back out of the fanfiction like everyone else? Like, fanfiction is not a required reading in fandom, you didn't have to read it. So even the woman who coined the term clearly had internalized misogyny in her. And again, while I believe that Mary Sue and Gary Stu could have a place in media literacy, again, about how a plot and all the characters just fold over just for this one character, that is not how anyone uses it anymore. It is used simply as an insult, I am mad a woman exists. It has gone beyond the original meaning in its fanfiction term, and it's even gone beyond the media itself. If you are a woman in fandom, particularly in a fandom that is usually male-dominated or perceived to be for men only, you are not going to be respected. To use Star Wars as a classic example, because Star Wars starts everything, there was a cosplayer who said she no longer brings Rey to conventions because of the harassment she would get, either harassment because she likes the sequels or sexual harassment. If you're a woman in Star Wars who likes something and someone disagrees, sometimes the insult isn't like, oh, I disagree with your opinion, it's, you're a woman, you're not allowed to have that opinion. And now because a female character, again, is the main character of what was usually a male-dominated space, a lot of these sexist male bros just feel so threatened. Hence, taking a term that was coined by women in fanfiction and using it against all women now. In fact, none of you are allowed to use Mary Sue anymore. That is unless you go into AO3 read a 200k fanfic on the Omegaverse. Call me back after you read a fanfiction where Obi-Wan gets pregnant with Cal Kestis, and then we can talk about you using the word Mary Sue. You can't use that term Mary Sue until you've dived into fanfiction yourself. Hunter is also here because I worked hard on this cosplay and I don't wear him as much, so appreciate it.
However, it can be said that the primary producers and readers of fanfiction at the time were women, and that the impact of this high female population was a lower amount of overt misogyny and violence against women in fanfiction. As was reported in Star Trek and the Culture of Fandom in 2011, one study found that 57% of Star Trek fans were women, reflecting the long history of female-dominated fandom. From Bijou Trimble and the original letter-writing campaign to save the original series, to Shirley Majeweski, known fondly as the godmother of fandom, women have been a real driving force in Trek fandom. Various reports in the 1960s and 1970s rated female involvement in ranges between 17 and 80% at times, most especially in examining fanfic and clubs which were both female-dominated areas in fandom and continue to be today. A 2023 study of fandom found that about 53% of Archive of Our Own users identified as a cisgender female, and about 13% identified as non-binary, and the largest group of respondents were on the asexual spectrum at 27%, including asexual at about 19%, demisexual at about 6%, graysexual at about 3%, and agosexual at about 0.05%. This is a threefold increase from the 2013 survey, in which 9% identified as asexual. The next largest category was bisexual, at about 25%, which is comparable to the 2013 study, which found 23% to be bisexual. The third most frequent identity was queer at 15%. Now, if this study was done more accurately and recorded sex in addition to gender identity, it seems evident that women continue to dominate fandom culture, and in particular, fanfiction. Another area of interest is the large number of people who identify as asexual, which has tripled from the 2013 version of the study. Why are so many female fanfiction fans identifying as asexual? It seems evident that in a cultural climate which presents its hypersexuality as the norm, and where pornography is normalized, inescapable, and often violent, that women and girls, who tend to be portrayed in degrading and painful scenarios, might view their own lack of interest in such subjugation as being proof of asexuality. We live in a culture which glorifies both the obtainment of and possession of sex objects. What this means is that both the act of being sexualized as well as being the consumer of sex are treated as positions of desire. People wish to be wanted sexually as well as to possess others sexually. The difference between these two positions are slight at first glance, but can be seen in both the widespread acceptance of porn consumption as well as in the rise of the pro-sex work and libfem movements. Porn consumption itself is dangerous. Zillman and Bryant sought to answer what is the effect of prolonged porn consumption on subjects' perceptions of their intimate relationships, marriage and family, personal happiness, and sexual satisfaction. The study found a pool of male and female subjects, including college students and non-students, were divided into two groups. Exposure group watched 1 hour of nonviolent porn per week for 6 weeks. The control group watched an equivalent amount of regular movies. Then, all subjects completed a value of marriage survey and the Indiana Inventory of Personal Happiness. They found that prolonged exposure to porn impacts the individual's sexual and personal happiness, increasing distrust and dissatisfaction with one's partner, increasing acceptance of affairs, promiscuity, and male-dominated relationships, and decreasing the desire to marry or raise a family. Given that in this era, 6 hours of exposure over 6 weeks was considered dangerous usage, what does this say about those who watch porn regularly today?
People in the scanner and looked at their brain activity. We were interested in what effects do potentially long-term usage of pornographic material have on brain structure. So basically we found in our study that the gray matter in the reward center is generally smaller in those people who watch more porn. What we also did is look at how the brain region that is smaller in structure, namely the reward region, is connected to other parts in the brain. We found that the more porn people watch, the less well the reward region is connected to prefrontal cortex. That their prefrontal cortex was less well able to control activity in the reward region. So the connection between prefrontal cortex, that is the braking mechanism, onto the reward system was less strong.
Additionally, porn seemed to condition participants to trivialize rape. In one study, participants were asked to read about a legal case where a man raped a female hitchhiker and then recommended a length of the rapist person's sentence. Males in the no exposure group said 94 months. The massive exposure group said 50 months, nearly half that of the no exposure group. One quote by Dr. James B. Weaver puts this into perspective especially well. Prolonged exposure to pornography, it must be remembered, results in both a loss of respect for female sexual autonomy and the disinhibition of men and the expression of aggression against women.
Porn is making men and society weaker. The implantation and monopolization of in every single industry is done on purpose. Children are being raised by the system and getting their hands on this violent, graphic garbage at very young, developmentally profound ages. You want to know what all serial killers have in common? Pornography consumption. Even your TikTok and Instagram feeds, soft PORN is programming your brain. Rewire neural pathways through repetition, and it completely skews their perception of reality. Pornography affects the brain through intense stimulation of the reward system, ultimately making consumption more rewarding. To make real intimacy and connection seem less interesting in comparison. And social media can do the same thing. It takes our brain's natural stimuli, our desire for intimacy and connection, our longing to feel strong or desirable in our relationships, and completely squanders it. For your brain thinks you're already getting this purposeful interaction. And the more and more you consume, the more intense and hardcore it has to get. That's exactly what they want, to shape predators, to breed purposeless men with no motivation that dehumanize half of the entire human population. Division and corruption at its finest.
The result of the widespread acceptance of pornography is the pornification of fanfiction.
What's something that people glamorize that's actually just extremely toxic?
Some of your booter be real mad at me, but kinks like choking, blood play, knife play being made available to 12-year-olds on the internet. There is no reason why any form of sexual behavior should be targeted at children. Fanfictions that involve YA and sleeping with Harry Styles are not normal, and do not make you exotic and kinky. BCU used to read it at 11 years old. It's damaging.
Because fanfiction is written, it is viewed as less impactful than visual stimuli, and given that media centered around the chase of orgasms already viewed as beyond reproach by many, fanfiction is hardly acknowledged for the role it plays in the sexuality of its readers. Fan of a Certain Age wrote about this back in 2019, where she noted, "Young writers replicate what they've seen and read, both in fandoms and other media, in order to make their work appeal to readers filtering by particular tags or seeking out specific kinks. And it feels like fandom descriptions of sex are becoming more like imitations of straight porn and other provocative media made for men. There's more emphasis on penetrative sex in slash fiction instead of things like frottage, mutual masturbation, or oral. There's more degradation in acts like verbal humiliation and ejaculating on faces, more demeaning language, and men referring to each other as sluts and whores and bitches. There's more violence in acts like spanking and choking. There is also, and this is the thing I frankly find more confusing, a strange insistence on feminizing gay and bi men, dressing gay male characters in lingerie, giving them the role of the omega bitch in heat, or giving them embarrassing hormonal episodes in impreg fic. I think fanfiction should be regarded in much the same way as any other erotica or pornography, and that means careful consideration of its effects on both readers and writers when consumed regularly or in large quantities, especially when it comes to depictions of unusual or non-vanilla acts, i.e. kinks and fetishes. Please bear in mind that I have absolutely no objection to either kink or fetish play between consenting adults, or accurate depictions of such in media, including fan works. What concerns me is the growing trend in fanfiction for including kink and fetish as a standard, expected part of adult relationships, particularly when these depictions are unresearched and therefore lacking awareness of the full implications, or are present because fandom has replicated the idea that kink, power play, humiliation, and violence are the standard for adult relationships. Additionally, many female readers of fanfiction, and more so of slash or yaoi, find themselves identifying as trans and gay. In other words, as straight females who pretend at male homosexuality.
Switching sides.
It's kind of funny. Said it was raining, but the sun's out.
This is a judgment-free zone, a safe space. You're surrounded by like-minded people. You can be honest. Are you ready to talk about the pipeline between transitioning and reading ABL fanfiction? Come on, it was your first clue. You've been reading it since you were 11. Don't tell me you don't see it. Come on now.
Why is fanfiction dominated by women writing stories about gay male relationships?
Check back in with those women in 10 years and see if they are still women.
This, in turn, stems from the female portrayal of male couples in slash, which create men who are female ideals and not representative of actual men. As noted in Helen Joyce's Joyce Activated. In an influential essay in 1985, Pornography by Women for Women with Love, the late Joanna Russ, a science fiction author and feminist theorist, argued that the characters in slash were not exactly male. The sex scenes were often vague about what exactly was being penetrated, and the feelings and emotions of the receiving partner were reminiscent of those of a woman making love with a man. The constant references to the character's genitalia, Russ thought, were disguises. Badges that said, "Hello, I have a penis, I'm a man." The endless hesitations and yearnings of the plots resembled the manufactured misunderstandings of the romance genre. This raises the question, why project it all onto male bodies? Why don't the women who read slash simply read romances and be done with it? She asked, why the drag? One thing that has happened in the 6 years since I first wrote that article about fanfic is that it has become enormously more pornified. Not just the slash, the male-female couplings too. Most stories are tagged, with characters and pairings, with story types, happily ever after, alternate universe, etc. And if they're classified as explicit, with sex acts. So it's easy to get a sense of overall shares of material and trends simply by doing search for various tags. Well, I don't even remember seeing slapping, choking, or hitting tagged back in 2017. And though anal was sometimes tagged, it wasn't common. That has completely changed, and all those tags are really commonplace, along with much more explicit terms that used to be unknown outside hardcore porn. I now think that there is a doom loop between the porn that boys and young men watch and the fic that girls and young women write and read. I've heard young women say it's now normal for young men to expect to do anal and to choke them and spit on them, and that the porn these men are watching is obviously blamed. Well, the young men say this that young women expect it too, and I now think they really do. These practices cross over into fanfic, where they're normalized among girls and made to seem exciting and satisfying. So both sexes think the other expects them, and both sexes are correct to think this. It is somewhat difficult to provide statistics on the increased usage of certain tags or ideas, but as anyone who has been involved in fandom for a long time can tell you, many trends have changed the landscape of fanfiction. For example, in the past, original characters, or OCs, often allow the author to self-insert into a fandom by creating their own character to interact with the plot and canon characters. Some of these characters were well written, many were not. A common issue was characters that were either overpowered and super special, such as Ebony, Darkness, Dementia, Raven Way, or the original Mary Sue, or targets for angst or tragedy, such as being abused, ill, or otherwise victimized. In both cases, the OC would often have the romantic attention of one or more canon characters, allowing the writer to live vicariously through their OC. These tropes could be enjoyable, and certainly some OCs were well written enough that people did enjoy and read those stories. If you didn't enjoy this type of content, it was easy to avoid these stories by simply avoiding ones with OCs. Today, it is much harder to do so, as writers instead pick a canon character to imprint on, resulting in personal interpretations such as turning characters trans, or giving them a myriad of mental health issues. This is not only annoying, as it overwrites the actual canon character with what is often an unfounded victimization, but it also tends to turn homosexual pairings into heterosexual ones. The other side of this issue is the prevalence of heterosexual women identifying as gay males. Many admit to being fans of slash or yaoi and use it as proof of the validity of their identity. However, the maleness they so identify with was written by women for women. It is not reflective of an actual man's mindset, beliefs, or behaviors, and thus, what they identify with is simply a heterosexual woman's perception of what a good man should be. Despite claims of bioessentialism often being launched at opponents of gender ideology, the fanfiction space, which is thoroughly inundated with gender ideology, explicitly supports gender essentialism through the Omegaverse trope.
No, it's not. In fact, far from it. Yo, you're brave. You're bold.
So basically that's what it means to exist within the Omegaverse, and we can delve into that a little bit more later, but I do remember going into top and bottom dynamics with you earlier, and I forgot to expand on power bottoms, and I think the name speaks for itself. Like, they're bottoms who know how to take charge, which is like refreshing and groundbreaking, and I like the existence of power bottoms because it implies that there are vulnerable tops, which in my opinion, at the end of the day, no matter what position you're in, everyone's allowed to feel submissive and breedable and honestly fertile. Please stop.
Omegaverse refers to any fanfiction which takes place in a universe where, in addition to the male and female sexes, there exists a secondary sex system of alphas, betas, and omegas. Alphas have very large penises and not at the base, like dogs. They go into ruts where they need to have sex or else suffer.
I already made this video once, but it got taken down, understandably and justifiably so, but you guys are persistent, and I'm a pushover, so once again we're joined by Mitt Romney to oversee today's lesson. I'm gonna keep this as PG as possible. You're gonna have to use your imagination so I don't get the video taken down and banned again. Right? We're gonna say that this is an unspecified alpha body part. This unspecified alpha body part then gets encased, right, in omega. This part of alpha body part, unspecified, swells, forms a knot, right? Then it can't be pulled out. It can't be pulled out.
Betas are regular humans. Omegas are of the receiving sex, when they go into heats where they need to have sex with a knot, produce a lot of slick or lubrication, and get pregnant easily. Female alphas are essentially trans women. Male omegas differ depending on the writer and can either have a very tiny penis, a non-functional penis, a lubricating and birth-giving asshole, or an actual vagina. The first stories using Omegaverse terminology popped up in the early 2010s in the fandom adjacent to the TV show Supernatural, except they focused on the actors, not the characters. Jensen Ackles was the first Omega, and Jared Padalecki was the first Alpha.
Yeah, so the Omegaverse is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of tropes that existed before it. Stuff like Mpreg, werewolves, fated mates, heat or mating cycles. But the first, what's considered the first Omegaverse fanfiction was published on LiveJournal in 2010. It's a Supernatural RPF with Jensen Ackles and Jared Padalecki, and it's called I Ain't No Lady But You'd Be the Tramp. Then in the following months, it kind of evolved and took off, and now we have the Omegaverse, as it's known today. The more you know, or whatever.
Some of the tropes that are common in Omegaverse go back further too. Star Trek's concept of the Vulcan mating cycle, Ponfar, lines up well with the Omegaverse idea of heat, and fans have been finding ways to get men pregnant in their fanfiction since at least 1988. The draw of Omegaverse is similar to that of sex pollen or aphrodisiacs. It reduces people down to an animalistic desire for sex and plays into dubcon, or dubiously consensual sex. In turn, this is enticing for many readers because it offers a justification for sex, implies that all sex under these conditions is good sex, and removes the need to have active engagement in sex because they believe they have the excuse that if they were forced to do it, even in play with full consent, they cannot be held accountable for wanting it.
Yeah. Well, it's misogynistic and homophobic, but I'll tell you about it. It also stems from incest, so if you open any Omegaverse piece of media, especially the comic/manga of it, you will find a guide to what the Omegaverse is. There are three main types of thing, although there can be others. There is Omega, Beta, and Alpha. Omegas are basically females. They're the things we push female roles onto. Alphas are the male roles, and betas are insignificant because you will rarely come across them, but they are the majority of the population. It is an evolved state of humans where omegas can get pregnant and alphas impregnate omegas. So it's basically alpha and omegas. It is used as an excuse to have gay relationships that fit heteronormative tropes. So the omega gets pregnant. They have this heat cycle, which is all similar to what a period is. They're more emotional. They're smaller and weaker. It's stereotypes. It's what it is. It originally came from a Wincest fic, which is Sam X. Dean Winchester fanfiction from Supernatural. There's also different forms of omegas depending on your media. There's dominant omegas or submissive omegas. There's also dominant alphas and submissive alphas. It basically just changes the way they interact with each other. Yeah, that's more. But honestly, just go to any website with comments, search up Omegaverse, open it, and there's the first 3 pages is just a guide to it. There's also a Wattpad fanfiction, not a Wattpad fanfiction, and there's a Wattpad story that is also a guide to it as well, which isn't that bad either. I gave you the main plot of it. There's a lot of stuff involved as well, what are the heat cycles? And there's marking them, which is you bite the back of the neck, and that omega is basically yours, and if you ever abandon that omega, the omega dies. There's nesting, which is a thing omegas do. There's the heat cycles. Both alphas and omegas experience heat cycles. Alphas will want to breed. It's kind of like what animals have to experience in heat cycles. So it's basically humans x dogs. Yeah.
The sexualization of rape is nothing new, as noted in Understanding and Indulging in Rape Fantasy. Bivona, Citrelli, and Clark found that 62% of participants, consisting of 355 women from 2 state universities in the southwestern United States, reported having rape fantasies in varying degrees of frequency and type. In Len Miller's 2018 survey results of 4,175 adults in the United States, he found that 2/3 of women in the study had rape fantasies, and half the men surveyed reported having rape fantasies. However, Where Omegaverse stands out is the depiction of alphas as being innately rapists, and omegas as always being consenting due to biology. When you reduce Omegaverse down to genitalia and sexual roles, it becomes a progressive acceptance of rape myths, disguised by the fantastical elements wherein women always want it and men are incapable of resisting. When you include the focus on reproduction, often referred to as a breeding kink, the misogyny evident in the trope becomes impossible to ignore. Erasing homosexuality, focusing on reproduction and penis and vagina sex as the pinnacle of sexual reproduction, these illustrate that while fanfiction had once served as a liberal and contained space for the expression of not just female sexuality, but for inspired storytelling, it has become mainstream and now is inextricably influenced by its normalization, most notably by pornography. While fanfiction had once been the realm of female writers and often created stories which reflected greater issues, greater accessibility and the tendency for active fandoms to primarily cater to young women, as well as the rising hypersexuality in general culture, has created a microcosm that leads girls to view extreme sex as normal. This manner of writing perpetuates misogyny through the incorporation of transidentity with any gender nonconforming male or female, and leads to the glorification of rape, BDSM, and other violent sex practices. Whereas fanfiction used to offer community and offer high-quality stories, fanfiction for modern fandoms is tainted by hypersexuality and the pornification that has been influencing the world at large. This, dear viewers, is where we part. I've been reading and writing fanfiction since I was 12. There's still stories from my initial attempts at writing stories back then where it was just my way of making all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fall in love with me because my insert was very obviously me. And I can't even say that the culture of fanfiction is one that I look back on very fondly. I've met real friends that I continue to speak with today, that I send Christmas gifts to, through fandom. I've learned how to write primarily through writing so much fanfiction. And I've noticed the shift over the years from the stuff that I read as a kid, which I still shouldn't have been reading, but at least it was relatively tame. It was always just kind of vanilla sex where it focused more on the characters' emotions and this feeling of satisfaction and romance, versus today where so much of fanfiction is dubious consent, it's got rape in it in some way, there's a whole bunch of biological essentialism, misogyny is so prominent, and I mean it's always been there, but now at least it's just so obvious, it's so hard to ignore. And the fact that it's become such a widespread and accepted thing, it's so common to where a lot of girls get their first sexual education from fanfiction. I certainly did. And if what you're learning is that knife play and dubcon and all these kinks are normalized, that's going to impact how you view sex with other people. And it makes sense that even though women tend to watch less porn than men, they're still getting this diet of pornification that's making it seem like, well, reading it is fine. I can get off to the ideas of my two favorite characters kissing or whatever, like smashing Barbie dolls together, but I don't want to be in a situation where my partner is choking me or stabbing me or whatever, so obviously I'm asexual. And this trend has been going on for a while. Our generation, my generation, is not having nearly as much sex or relationships or friendships and is so much more depressed than previous generations. And I think that the internet and ensuing changes to culture has been a huge blame for this. It's just anyhow, I might come back to Omegaverse in more depth later on, but I think that you guys get the gist. If you guys have any fanfiction tropes you'd like me to discuss in further detail, leave them in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.